This video is part of the GRESB Assessment Training Program. In this video, we will review the structure of the fund assessments. We'll introduce the fund assessment structure, describe its components, and its relationship with the asset assessment. Next, we'll look at the aspect and weightings of the fund assessment components and the different types of scores that you can receive based on which components you report. Following this lesson, we recommend that you review the lessons Fund Assessment Entity and Reporting Characteristics and Fund Assessment Management Components Parts 1 and 2. We'll start with an overview of the two infrastructure assessments to establish the context for the fund assessment. GRESB provides two complementary infrastructure assessments, a fund assessment and an asset assessment. Both address critical aspects of ESG performance through a globally applicable and standardized reporting and benchmarking framework. The fund assessment is intended for infrastructure funds and portfolios of assets, while the asset assessment is completed by individual assets. In many cases, these assets will be owned by and form part of an infrastructure fund. Both the fund and asset assessments consist of management and performance components, but it is important to note that a fund does not complete a performance component itself. Instead, the underlying assets of the fund comprise this. If more than 25% of the fund's underlying assets complete the infrastructure asset assessment, the scores of these assets are averaged and the fund will obtain a performance score infrastructure fund. For the asset assessment score to contribute to the performance score of a participating fund, the fund must be linked to the asset. There is a simple process for this that is described in detail in the lesson Fund Assessment Performance Component. Now let's focus on the fund assessment. The GRESB Infrastructure Fund Assessment is the global standard for ESG benchmarking and reporting for listed infrastructure companies and private infrastructure funds. As mentioned earlier, the fund assessment has two components, management and performance. The management component measures the entity's strategy and leadership management, policies and processes, risk management, and stakeholder engagement approaches, and comprises information collected at the entity level. The performance component measures the entity's performance, comprised of information collected at the asset level. It is suitable for any infrastructure company or fund with operational assets. A fund does not complete a performance component itself. Instead, its underlying assets submit their own assessments. If more than 25% of the fund's underlying assets complete the infrastructure asset assessment, the score of these assets are averaged and the fund will obtain a performance score infrastructure fund. Looking in a little more detail, there are some additional parts to the assessment. The entity and reporting characteristics identify the asset entity and describe its main characteristics and how it will report. These characteristics inform both the management and performance components. Each of these assessment components is shown in the menu at the top left corner in the portal, as shown here. Let's take a look at the aspects and weightings of the components of the fund assessment. The management component consists of 5 aspects: leadership, policies, reporting, risk management, and stakeholder engagement. It is composed of 22 indicators, here represented by the green circles, 16 of which are scored. This chart shows the scoring weightings of each aspect. The risk management aspect, at 11.8%, has the highest aspect weighting, followed by leadership at 6.7%. Funds do not complete a performance component themselves. Instead, the underlying assets of the fund complete it. The performance component accounts for 70% of the GRESB score infrastructure fund. At least 25% of the fund's underlying investments by equity share need to participate to complete this component for a fund. In this diagram, we see the names of the different fund scores. The score for the management component is called Management Score Infrastructure Fund. This component is weighted at 30% of the overall GRESB Infrastructure Fund assessment, and so the total score is also out of 30 points for this component. The score for the performance component is called the Performance Score Infrastructure Fund, also the weighted average asset score. The performance component is scored out of 70 total points. The overall or combined score for the fund is called the GRESB Score Infrastructure Fund and is out of 100 points. Thank you for taking the time to complete this lesson. We hope that it helped you get a better understanding of the GRESB Infrastructure Fund assessment and prepared you to complete the assessment accurately. For any questions, you can contact us at gresb.com/contact.